everyone. Hi, I'd just like to say a big welcome to you all for joining us. I know we've got some Arup people and some externals who've been joining us for this talk, and it's great that you've been able to come. I've just got a bit of housekeeping. So we're not expecting any alarms, and in the event of alarm happening, we will be leaving the building, up the stairs and mustering in Fitzroy Garden, but just follow Arup staff. The exits are through these doors here, and the toilets and bathrooms are just in the far corner of the external space. Okay, so a bit about myself. I lead the Arup Historic Environment team within the wider environment team in consulting, and I manage the Built Heritage, Archaeology and Cultural Heritage projects. I've started with Arup in 1997 in Australia as a sub-consultant, and I joined Arup here in 2006. Full-time. But I have a deep interest in cultural heritage and how it informs who we are, our individual identity and our community identity, and what happens when we can't access meaningful elements of our cultural heritage. That's a little bit separate to what we're going to be talking about, but that's my in a little bit there. But what I've always valued about Arup is how it supports its staff to get involved in transformational topics, the topics that they're interested in and how they really do shape a better world. And this talk organised by Amar is an example of such a transformational opportunity. So we live in a world where we all have knowledge of and some have experienced movement from our places of origin. And for many of us, that movement's been our choice. But what happens to people who are forcibly moved or forcibly displaced from their homes due to reasons such as ethnic cleansing, war and conflict, and violence making, where people's hometowns and their countries are dangerous? Refugees and internally displaced persons can lose everything as a result of this forcible displacement. So my first grasp of this came from working with Indigenous Australians back home. And following white expansion to Australia in the 1800s, the land was declared terra nullius. Indigenous peoples had no rights to their land. And local communities, whilst not overtly displaced by conflict, were most definitely displaced aggressively. And there were massacres and a lot of the aggression that you would find in many parts of the world that lead to displacement. But then came the forced removal of the stolen generation, and in an effort to disrupt the transmission of culture of Indigenous groups. The children were forcibly removed from parents and placed in missions a long way from their tribal lands. The loss of language, customs and access to cultural heritage and the transmission of that intangible cultural heritage had devastating effects in terms of identity and self-worth for many of people. And I worked with the descendants of many of these Indigenous Australians who had been forcibly displaced, the descendants who never had access to land. And I was party many times, would go on surveys to them returning to their land as traditional owners for the first time and finding their sites and their places that had meaning to them. And it was quite a powerful process. And as a result of their own experiences, I know many Indigenous groups in Australia have felt a sense of solidarity towards refugees as a result. And just further to that, I think when we're looking at some of the work that we see in people talking about refugees and internally displaced persons, the world politics can sometimes translate people into numbers. We read that there are 70.8 million individuals who've been forcibly displaced by persecution, conflict or violence or human rights violations. 55% of refugees come from just 3 countries, which is Syria, South Sudan, Afghanistan. And that in 2017, Britain received just 3% of all asylum applications in the EU. But they're statistics and they don't tell us the real story about what's going on behind those numbers. Communities and people become those numbers. And whilst it's important on that one level to quantify, it can help us forget that these people are individuals that come from really rich histories and heritage, from places of significance to them, built environments they've left behind, are testaments to their unique cultural response and experience of living in a place, and we can forget that they can bring with them a rich culture of their own into these places. So as the stories we hear are negative, because displacement is a negative experience, it's really been refreshing to hear about Professor Dawn Chatty's work and how this negative experience can also be transformed by the generosity of spirit of people and their response to the duty of providing hospitality in many of the regions around the Middle East and Syria that we're going to hear about. And it's that positive experience. The Syrian culture has welcomed people from so many neighbouring areas over the last 150 years. And it's great to see how this is being reciprocated, and it'll be good to hear more about that. I look forward to hearing that. But I'd now like to hand over to Amar Aziz, who has made this opportunity possible, and he will introduce Professor Dawn Chatty and her work. Amar is an architect with Arup, and he's been working with a number of institutions over the past few years to look at how we rebuild better in places affected by conflict, particularly in his hometown of Homs in Syria, and at how we support internally displaced people and refugees. And so, Amar, to hand over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much, Susanna. It's really a privilege to have you all, and I really appreciate and thanks a lot, Professor Dawn Chatty, for accepting the invite to tell us about an alternative image of the Syria that we see in the news, an image of richness and diversity and openness. Thank you very much, Dawn. Dawn Chatty is emeritus a professor in anthropology and forced migration and the former director of Refugee Studies Centre at the University of Oxford in the UK. She is also a fellow of the British Academy. Her research interests include coping strategies and resilience of refugees' youth, tribes and tribalism, nomadic pastoralism and conservation, gender and development, health, illness and culture. She has edited numerous books including Nomadic Societies in the Middle East and North Africa, Facing the 21st Century in 2006, Children of Palestine Experiencing Forced Migration in the Middle East in 2005, and Conservation and Mobile People, Displacement, Forced Settlement and Sustainable Development in 2002. She is also the author of Displacement and Disposition in the Middle East, published at Cambridge University Press in 2010, From Camel to Truck, White Horse Press in 2013, and most recently, which is the focus of today's lecture, Syria, the Making and Unmaking of a Refuge State, published in 2018, and there will be a very limited number of books to be signed after the event if you're interested in getting a copy. So I think many of us, like for displaced persons like myself, I left Syria in 2011. The country that we access to is only through memory and through remembering and through imagined place that we remember, and how wonderful to remember a place in a beautiful way that hopefully Dawn will show us this history of rich societies and communities who survived, flourished and maintained in this region throughout history. So please welcome Dawn Chatty.
Amar, that's a pretty big ask. I hope I can do that. I want to start first by asking, have any of you visited Syria before 2011? Okay, so we have a few who have visited Syria. I think you'll agree with me when I say that one of the really special features of Syria for those who had visited before was this amazing, I'm going to call it local cosmopolitanism. Some people called it local conviviality, generosity, openness to outsiders, to the other, which is all considered really quite unusual. Normally the other is regarded as an individual that could be threatening because they're different. But those people who had traveled to Syria generally came out remarking at how multicultural it was. It was almost postmodern because there were people from, you had Arab, you had Bedouin, you had Druze, you had Kurds, you had Armenians, you had Assyrians, which people were always confused, what is an Assyrian? All these different groups, and they all lived together. And what I would like to try and do today is to show how that came about, but to also show how it has been, what came about is so different from the image that I think most of us have of Syria, particularly after the mass influx of mainly Syrians, but also others along the Balkan corridor in 2015, which is when most people began to hear about the humanitarian crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe and so on. And it was this movement of about 1 million Syrians who, for many different reasons, had decided that they couldn't go back ISIS had taken over about 80% of the country, and also the regime had very active assistance and support from Russia in its barrel bombing and bombardment of areas of the country that were opposing the government. So it was not surprising that people felt there was no choice but to move on. However, very sadly, I would say, the European response, so the response amongst politicians in Europe, was somehow to push back against this massive influx. Some people would say it started in Hungary, but I think in general there was this sense that don't let all these people in, it's an influx, some not very nice words were used, and let's just find a way of justifying containing them in the area that they were in. So what I'm going to try and show is that the Europeans didn't have to work at containment, if you put it that way, that Syria and its neighbors had a long history of integrating refugees and migrants, and for the short period of time that we're looking at now, since I guess most of the movement out in 2013, 2014, we can still look back at the modern Syrian state, its cultural plurality, and wonder as to whether that local conviviality and that cosmopolitanism that was an important characteristic of its citizens, particularly in the 19th and 20th century, whether that's going to remain or not. I should just say here that neither Syria nor none of the states that surround it, so Lebanon, Jordan, northern Iraq, have not signed the 1951 Convention nor the 1967 Protocol, and these are the elements of what I'm going to call treaty-based international law that countries sign and undertake to accept people seeking asylum. So none of the countries around Syria or Syria have that human rights obligation, if I can put it that way. So what we might consider that as something negative, but what I hope I'm going to be able to show is that in fact that whole idea of providing asylum or providing sanctuary in the region has always been regarded as a duty, as an obligation of individuals, of families, and of states, and often is referred to as karam, generosity, but there are a lot of other terms that are used as well. So let me just start with a few images. Those of you who haven't been, but I'm sure you know, you've seen images. I just wanted to show you the Umayyad Mosque first. You might also know that the Umayyad Mosque was originally the Basilica of St. John the Baptist, and supposedly his head is in the mosque, and many Christians enter the mosque and they go to say their prayers at his tomb. But Damascus is also a place of, I don't want to use too many Oriental words, it still maintains its old-fashioned markets, where you have numerous sellers of the same item, all side by side. I used to wonder how they ever made a profit, since if you didn't like the price one person was quoting, you just walked up to the next stall and you got what you wanted. So this is just the spice market around the corner from the souk. Another image that I think, again, you may be familiar with. There are many Crusader castles in Syria. This, the Crac de Chevalier, is perhaps one of the most famous. It did have a bit of damage, but nothing that cannot be sort of repaired. Its other name is the Castle of the Knights Hospitaliers, made famous in the Third Crusade. When they were finally defeated by Salah ad-Din, they were given free passage to Rhodes, and eventually they made a bit of a mess of things in Rhodes, and they were allowed then to move to Malta, and today we know them as the Order of Malta, or the Knights of Malta. So this was where they had their base. The other image is that of Salah ad-Din, who defeated Richard the Lionhearted in the Third Crusade and took back Jerusalem for a period of time. So a lot of very interesting monuments. For me, because most of my work started with nomads or with Bedouin or people who were being forced to settle by their governments, I've always been very interested in the desert areas of Syria and North Arabia. One is the image of Palmyra, which was a city-state that at one point extended from Anatolia to Egypt and then was brought down by Aurelian in 272 AD, so quite extensive. And the other is a cafe built by two Bedouin brothers on the road to Palmyra. I think they saw the film Baghdad Cafe, German film, I think came out in the 1980s, so that's why they gave it that name. But a lot of what I'm going to call the millennial travelers have enjoyed stopping there where they can get a drink, but you can also rent one of those domed rooms for the night on your way. So a country of a great deal of contrast. But what I want to develop is how did it get to be what it was, and is it really unwinding? So I'll move quickly through some parts of this presentation and take a little bit more time on others. I'll talk about the modern history of Syria as a place of refuge. And I'll just make an aside. I had one very big problem with the publisher when my book came out, because although I had approved the cover, Syria, the making and unmaking of a refuge state, I guess, I don't know whether it's the typesetter or who it is, thought I didn't know how to spell refugee and added an E. And I had to go back and get them to pull all the covers because I really wanted them to understand it's about a place that's been providing sanctuary for people from the whole of the Mediterranean, the Balkans, for really the last 150 years. So I will also talk then about the 19th century response to forced migrants and the local response in, I've called it Greater Syria here. I look at the response during the interwar mandate between World War I and World War II after the Ottomans were defeated. I'll also briefly talk about the Syrian response really up until 2010, and then what is happening in the contemporary period. You know, we talk about the 21st century as being a period that's defined by forced migration, but what I'm going to try and show is that actually the whole of the Levant was defined by forced migration starting from around 1850. And this pattern of migration that we're seeing now actually has its origins in the millions of displaced social groups from the borderlands between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century. And I'll go back over that a little bit more carefully, but let me just make sure that I don't confuse you by showing you at least a map of what was considered Syria, Bilad-al-Sham, Greater Syria. So in this case, it actually extended from Jebel Arish here at the in Sinai up to Antioch or Alexandretta, whatever term that you want to use, and then into Damascus and its hinterland. So this is what was generally regarded in the 19th century as Syria. Later on, it began to be called Greater Syria. And so many of the groups that I'm talking about didn't just settle in these areas, but it's in this wider region that was considered the southern region of the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't a province, but it was recognized as a region. Bilad-al-Sham also had, for some of these migrants, an important religious significance attached to Muhammad. So let me just now turn to look at what this region looked like in the 19th century. So we've got the area that today we consider Syria right there in the middle. The whole of the 19th century was a period of warfare fought between the Ottoman Empire, which is outlined here, and Imperial Russia. Starting with Catherine the Great at the very end of the 18th century, Russia was on a huge expansionist program, and it fought 6 wars with the Ottoman Empire throughout the 19th century. The Ottomans lost 5 of these wars, and with each loss, they lost more land. The one war that the Ottomans were able to win was the Crimean War of 1856, and I'll go over that in a minute, because with each war there were major changes to the borders, but the War of 1856 is particularly important. So, what I want to show here, and I'll start with this Crimean War, is that with each of these wars, this region that we think of as Greater Syria received sometimes as many as 500,000 people over 1 or 2 years. And the question we'll be asking is, how did they do it? So if I talk first about the Crimean War of 1856, the Ottomans won that war, and historians generally say they won that war because the British, the French, and the Italians were really afraid that they were going to be defeated by the Russians. And what the Russians had always wanted was Constantinople, and they wanted somehow a way out through the Dardanelles so that they had a port on the Mediterranean. So that's going back to 1850, 1856. But actually, this war started with an argument between Napoleon III and Alexander I of Russia. And I sometimes, I sort of mock the war by saying it started as an argument over who should have the keys to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. And I don't have time to go into this, but throughout the whole of the Ottoman Empire, the sultans of the empire gave gestures of friendship to the different kings of Europe, and these were called capitulations. So very early on, actually it was Suleiman the Magnificent gave Francois I of France the capitulation that his citizens who were in the Ottoman Empire could follow the rules of France. So if a Catholic was in trouble, they could follow the rules of France, and along with that came this notion that French Catholics could look after Catholic churches in the region. Russia also had a capitulation, and with that, the Russian Orthodox monks were in the region, and they were looking after some of the churches. But over time, the Russian Orthodox monks began to move in and were taking over, looking after almost all the churches in the region. And Napoleon III wanted the Church of the Holy Sepulchre back to him and to the Catholics. So Russia got very upset. They attacked the Ottoman fleet in the Black Sea. They sank it in its entirety, and Britain and France were really worried that was going to be the end of the Ottoman Empire, so they joined. And we all know about the charge of the Light Brigade and the Battle of Balaclava, etc., etc. We probably also know this is where Florence Nightingale made her name and where Russian surgeons learned their skills of amputation. But it was also the first live media news coverage emerged at the Crimean War. What we forget is that the end result of the Crimean War was that the Russians insisted that the 500,000 Muslims in the Crimea had to leave. The negotiations of peace meant that 500,000 Muslims, the Tatars from the Crimea, also from the Ukraine and from Georgia, they had to sell up and they had to leave, and they had to go into the Ottoman Empire. So initially, they sold up and they sat in this part of the Ottoman Empire, which today we think of as the Balkans, but then was known as Rumeli. And within a year or two, they were followed by Cossacks and Circassians, Chechens, and Dagestani also, who followed and moved into this area. The Russians at this point were feeling very strong, and they continued their campaign. By 1860, they defeated the imamate of the Caucasus here that was headed by a Sufi leader, Imam Shamil of Chechnya, and with his defeat, another 500,000 Circassians, Abkhazi, Dagestani also had to leave. They were actually forced to leave. They weren't given time, although the Ottomans did bring in a few steamships to help them move into the Balkans. But then some also started moving into Anatolia itself. So by 1860, about 2 million people had been displaced in 4 years and had entered into the Ottoman Empire and into Anatolia. But many of the Muslims who entered into this part, again, were facing serious unrest, because in the European part of the Ottoman Empire, there was almost 50% Christian, 50% Muslim. And as more Muslims were coming in, this balance was being displaced. And eventually there were a series of massacres which were covered by the European press and regarded in the UK as particularly offensive to Christian morality, and moves were made then to push Muslims out of the Balkans as well. a quick image of Shamil and his sons who were defeated by the Russians. Then he was sent into exile at St. Petersburg and eventually allowed to be buried in Mecca. So that takes us up to the 1870s. When we get to the 1870s, we have the last of the 6 Ottoman and Russian wars, which was actually won by the Russians, but in the Treaty of Berlin, Bismarck insisted that the Russians would pull back from the borders from the land that they had conquered, and they agreed to do that, but only as long as all of the Muslims in this area, all the Circassians, the Chechens, and Dagestani moved out. And it's at this point in the 1870s that more and more of them moved out into this region that we think of as Greater Syria. Some had come earlier, but the bulk of them then started arriving into this region. It was their second forced migration in less than 20 years, and many of them then began to settle in this area that we think of as Bilad-al-Sham. They were also surprisingly joined by about 50,000 Jews from the Pale of Settlement in this area who were now beginning to face pogroms in Russia, and many of them also came in and settled broadly in the southern part of Bilad-al-Sham, which is what we today think of as historical Palestine. So I just want to show you this settlement. It was really quite interesting. So 2 million people now at this stage, maybe 2.5 million Circassians, Chechens, Dagestani settling, and many of them, you can't, I think the light, I have to make this quite dark, were settling in what I in another kind of map would be called the Mamura, would be the area that's on the borderland between agriculture and herding. And they weren't forced to settle there, but they were encouraged to settle there in order to be a buffer between locally fighting communities. So the Circassians and the Chechens and the Dagestani ended up being pushed to sort of settle in areas where, for example, the Druze were fighting against the Bedouin, or the Kurds were fighting against the Druze. So they became they were instrumentalized by the Ottomans. The Ottomans also separated out the elite of these communities, fearful of them because they were a really hierarchical tribal community, and they had a reputation for being extraordinarily warlike. In their forced migration, as they settled in these areas here, most of them, if they didn't take up agriculture, somebody in the family joined the Ottoman army. So they were represented very, very heavily in the Ottoman military machinery. But they were also very strong and willing to work very hard. And in many of these areas, especially along the Euphrates and Tigris, were malarial swamps. And technology had moved in such a way that it was possible to drain the swamps. And the Ottomans, again, used the Circassians to help drain these swamps and then also give them access to more and more land. Just a couple of images of the Circassians. As I said, their national character was very mythologized. The military prowess of the men was perhaps not mythology. They were often used by the Ottomans for the militias, and they rose very quickly up the ranks of the Ottoman army. The women, it was quite interesting. Maybe there is some mythology here, maybe there's some element of truth, but the women were renowned for their beauty. They were often part of the Sultan's seraglio, and the Sultan often gave these women as gifts to other rulers to cement the relationships of the Ottoman Empire with outlying groups. So, for example, in the Hijaz, the Sharif of Mecca, who, if you know of some of the secret treaties in World War I, the McMahon Hussein correspondence about creating a kingdom of Syria. Well, Sharif Hussein's mother was a Circassian concubine. Around the same time, the Sultan of Oman had, I think, one of his last wives, Saeed bin Sultan. His wife was a concubine, and the daughter later on wrote a book that was very popular in Europe in the early 20th century about the life of a princess. But also these Circassian women within the field of anthropology, a very famous, I was going to say American, but maybe he's British, but he is in New York. Talal Asad is a very well-known anthropologist whose mother was also a concubine given to the father for good service to King Abdulaziz in Saudi Arabia. But this is an aside. So let me just now go back to, we've got this massive movement of people, 2.5 to 3 million people suddenly coming into the Ottoman Empire. And what do the Ottomans do? They recognized straight away that they couldn't cope with these numbers without somehow creating a system to deal with these huge numbers of dispossessed people. And what they decided was in their best interest was to disperse them as quickly as possible to provincial cities and to set out grounds for their protection. Their notion was we integrate these people quickly, they can become new subjects of the state, we don't force people to be assimilated, we just allow them to integrate, because of course the Ottoman Empire, as with most empires, was a multicultural empire, and they wanted to preserve that kind of multiculturalism by preserving not only religious attachments, but interestingly enough, architectural freedom. So all of these groups, particularly with the Circassians, they were permitted to build their mosques in the style that they were used to, which often look like outlying buildings in the Byzantine style rather than the style that you would be used to in the region. And their homes were always red-tiled roofs, which again is rather unusual for the region. So there was a great deal of freedom provided to these people. As long as you give your allegiance to the Sultan, you can live as you like, you practice the religion that you like, what have you. The Ottomans at that period also, the very long story, as they were losing part of the European part of their empire, as Greece was becoming independent, thanks to the work of Russia, and then Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, etc., they were losing a lot of their population, mainly the Christian part of their population, and they needed to attract immigrants. So as they were setting out rules for the incoming forced migrants, they were also advertising in Europe for immigrant families and groups to come to the Ottoman Empire, and if they had very little capital, they, along with refugees, would be provided with state land, they would be exempt from taxes, and they would be exempt from conscription, either for 6 or 12 years, depending upon the place in which they settled. I don't know if any of you are watching what we're doing to refugees today, but this is really forward thinking. I mean, it's like in the 19th century, they skipped the 20th century, and we're even ahead of what's called the Compact for Refugees, which was only just signed off in December 2018 in New York. No, that was in Morocco. 2016 was in New York. They had quite a significant responses for their advertisement from people in Switzerland, in Italy, in Bavaria, even in the US. It was free land, no taxation, and no military conscription over a period of time. And also for 20 years, they were not permitted to sell or leave the land in order to prevent land speculation. So a great deal of thought had gone into how do we help people who are coming in to settle, to integrate, and I'm going to use modern words because they weren't used at the time, to live in dignity, to become self-sufficient. The code became a commission in 1860, and the commission, as it became stronger, actually began also locating lands for resettlement, developing underpopulated areas, and of course, as I said before, this is very instrumental because if you get people on the land, if you get them successfully farming, then you can start taxing them, and the tax, of course, helps to support the government. But they went out of their way, even transporting immigrants to the various lands that they were assigned, and often in the first year providing them with housing, with seeds and animals in order to get through their first winter. There was a lot of decentralization, and one of the texts that I came across was in Damascus, in order to be able to provide this assistance in the first year that these Circassians and Chechens and Dagestani needed. Every household in Damascus was charged a single piaster annually in order to assist these refugees to settle. The closest I can get is that's about £10 per year in order to help the refugee. And I'm not sure how much choice people had, but I think they didn't have much trouble in raising these funds and getting these people out into areas in order to revive the agricultural sector in the outskirts. This commission also at that time, because there were so many other things going on, began to deal with a lot of the international aid, which was mainly missionary work. And at the same time, to allow these communities to disperse, but they still recognized them as belonging to one of the millets of the Ottoman Empire. So there wasn't a notion that people had to be tied in one place. There was a recognition that, for example, Circassians who settled in the Jolan or near Homs, or eventually in the area of the old Philadelphia in what is now Jordan, could have self-rule amongst themselves. So this notion of self-rule to the non-Muslim ethno-religious communities, the Armenian, the Jewish, and the Catholic and the Protestant, which had already existed in the Ottoman Empire, was also indirectly extended to these particular newcomers. So they had an element of self-rule, which permitted them to maintain their customs and not to feel in any way threatened as a minority or as an outsider. This is just a couple of images of refugees as they were flooding through Istanbul between the 1860s and 1880s, where basically the hospitals and mosques, churches, and also taqiyas, which were what I'm going to call the religious schools that included public soup kitchens, all turned over in order to help these hundreds of thousands of migrants move through the area until they could be assigned land, someplace in which they could start becoming self-sufficient and live with dignity. Obviously, this first group, the Circassians and the Chechens and Dagestani, were Muslim, so they were part of the main millah, but they felt the need to maintain their difference. They didn't speak Arabic, and their customs were different enough from the Arabs around them, and obviously very proud of their customs. Even in this context of settling in a very different place, they were able to maintain the cohesion of their community kind of horizontally from one community to another, not necessarily in one place. By the time we get to the 1890s, and this is the blue arrow, we start looking at Armenian forced migration out of Anatolia. There are many reasons for it, and I won't go into it now, but by the 1890s there were serious disturbances and unrest in areas of Armenian Kurdish settlement. The Armenians and the Kurds basically shared the same territory. They both regarded the same territory as being their nation. Often the Armenians at the top of the hills and mountains, and the Kurds in the lowlands as herders. But as Circassians and other Muslims groups began flowing out of these areas where they were being expelled by Russia and coming into these areas that were mainly made up of Armenian and Kurdish settlements, things began to take a turn for the worst. Many Armenians in this region began to feel that their future lay with Russia. There's been quite a bit of revision history now to show that the notion of the Armenians as being regarded as a fifth column by the Ottomans in the decades that came, probably there's some evidence to that, but the original massacre at Sassoon in 1894 began, I'm going to say, a trickle of Armenians leaving this region and finding settlements in Aleppo, in Damascus, but many also going to Egypt, to Jerusalem and to Egypt at that time. Eventually, that trickle became a flood with the massive numbers of Armenians as forced migrants, forced on death marches along the Euphrates, and the genocide that took place during that time. Nobody is really sure how many people died, but we do know that about 750,000 survived in Greater Syria, but perhaps 1 to 1.2 million were killed. However, once they reached the area that we consider Greater Syria, they tended to be able to find new places for themselves. That was only one outflow, 1914, 1915, somewhere around 750,000. Unfortunately, there was another outflow in 1921 when the French efforts to create a state for themselves in Cilicia failed, and Cilicia was returned to the new Turkish Republic. Armenians then also fled that region and entered into Syria and Lebanon. And then the last major outflow of Armenians was then in 1939-1940 when the French gave up the region of Hatay here to the Turkish government in order to try and persuade the Turkish government not to enter World War II on the side of Germany. And so there was this final wave. Many of them then also came to Aleppo, to Damascus, but a large number of them settled in Anjar on the Syrian-Lebanese border. Another group that also came in the 1920s were the Kurds. But I have to just say that the Kurds who entered into Syria, these are I've tried to indicate that with the yellow arrows, was a very small number, only about 10,000 to 15,000 at that time. And these were Kurds who were totally opposed to the secular Republic of Turkey and were adamant that they didn't want to live without having an Islamic caliphate, because Ataturk abolished the Islamic Caliphate in 1923, and the response was these Kurds rose up, and then they fled to Syria, joining Syrian Kurds, nearly 2 million of them, who had been in the region since the time of Salah ad-Din in the 13th century. Following with the Kurds, and around the same time in the 1930s, was a huge wave of Assyrians who came out of the Assyrians. Some of them were near the Hakkari Mountains up here, but many of them were in Iraq, who fled when the British withdrew, gave back their mandate to the League of Nations in 1932, but they left behind the Assyrian who had worked as their gendarmerie, who were then facing serious issues regarding their safety by Iraqis who felt that they had betrayed Iraq. So many of the Assyrians then also fled into Syria at that time. By the 1940s, we had even more Christian minorities, other Kurds, and then by 1947, 1948, over 100,000 Palestinian refugees also came into Syria. I'm going to speed up. This is Sheikh Said. These are some of the survivors of the revolt who came into Syria at that time. Now let me just look at the mandate period of Syria. This is the period where after World War I, at the Treaty of Paris, the peacemakers decided to carve up the Middle East between Great Britain and France. Despite the findings of the Inter-Allied Commission that was sent by Woodrow Wilson to the region to keep the whole of Syria as one state under mandate to the US, because the US was regarded by the population in the region as not being a colonial power. Congress rejected that proposal, and the mandate over Syria was given to France, and the southern part of Greater Syria, Palestine, was given to Great Britain. The French, I think, misjudged Syrians. This history of accepting people, giving them refuge, allowing them to become integrated, allowing them to just sort of build their lives, even though only over a period of 50 or 60 years, and joining other minority groups. was such that even by 1920, there was a kind of cohesion that the French misunderstood. One of the first things that the French tried to do, which I've indicated in this map, was to create statelets. So right away, they divided off Mount Lebanon, and they created a greater Lebanon by taking the Bekaa Valley, which was really the backyard of Damascus, creating Lebanon. They created an Alawite state. They also created the state of Alexandretta, Aleppo, Damascus, and a Druze state. But the people in Syria at the time were unwilling to accept that, and they rose up in revolt. And this was the Great Arab Revolt of 1922 to 1925-26, against the French government, but specifically against being divided up. Although people in particular were defeated in 1926, they continued then working politically, and by 1936, a delegation was actually sent to Paris and persuaded the French government to reunite Syria as one state, that all of its different peoples should be seen as one state. They again tried to persuade the French that they wanted Syria to be a constitutional monarchy. They nominated, at that time, Prince Faisal of Saudi Arabia, but the French rejected that. One of the good things, though, I mean, I'm being very critical about France, but one of the good things during the French mandate, and also in line with the League of Nations, Syrian citizenship was granted to all Armenians in the country, to all Kurds in the country, to all Assyrians in the country, and there was an attempt to grant citizenship to all Palestinian refugees who were in the country. There were secret negotiations that were taking place during the rule of Hosni Zayem and the Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion to provide citizenship to all Palestinians as long as the border between Syria and Israel could be defined, and the war status ended. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, depends on how you feel, Colonel Hosni Zayem was assassinated before they could consolidate that. But what the Syrians did do very soon after that, once the nation state was established after 1946, they were very quick to sign what was called the Casablanca Protocol, which was to provide refuge and temporary protection to Palestinians as to per their own citizens, and this was meant to be extended to other peoples. And if you look at Syria's response to forced migration, you see this openness to accepting Circassians, Chechens, in the 1890s to 1920s, many Albanians and Kosovars, Armenians, Kurds, Assyrians, Palestinians, several waves of Palestinians. And then in the 2000s, particularly between 2006 2007, 1.2 million Iraqis entered Syria without visas, but had access to work as well as free health care and education. They entered as Arab brothers. There are many different ways to take this argument forward, but the point is that it's not just the government that's accepting people, it's at the civic society level, the citizen that is accepting the stranger or the other in their midst. The 1.2 million Iraqis who entered in those 2 years had very little problem in quickly developing sustainable livelihoods and living with some kind of dignity. It's hard to these are kind of numbers, as you were saying before. You talk numbers, but if I try to put it in terms of the UK, it would almost be as though the entire population of Scotland, 5 million people, poured into England seeking refuge from some kind of calamity and remained for 8 or 9 years. How would England have managed? And I say that because today, even with the Vulnerable Peoples Program, the quota over 5 years for the UK is to accept up to 20,000 Syrians as long as they fit into the Vulnerable Peoples Program. So there was a kind of a generosity that emerged, I think, partially out of there not being one dominant ethnic or religious community, but many. not even considered minorities, but different groups. And I haven't even talked about the 5,000 Algerians that came over with Abdelkader al-Jazairi in the 19th century, and many of them stayed and created communities of their own. But the numbers are huge, and if you look at it, as this kind of map, the majority of them were Muslims, but there were also Jews, and there were also many Christians who entered and were able to put down roots, but also create what I call horizontal ties with other communities similar to them. There's a blurring of frontiers, and even with the kind of borders that existed, people had relatively easy access to moving within the region and seeking access in neighboring countries. So if I now turn to the situation after 2011, might make a little bit more sense then. The density of the refugee population is in the depth of the color red, obviously. And these are the temporary settlements where Syrians have fled. Obviously, those who had ties with Lebanon or had ties with the Bekaa went to Lebanon. So Lebanon, with a population of 4 million, has accepted about I think it's more like 1.5 million Syrians. That's like every fourth person would be somebody who you've given refuge to. Of course, the fact that prior to the fighting, 500,000 Syrians worked in Lebanon in the agricultural industry and the construction industry can also explain the kind of economic ties and social ties that existed. But still, people were accommodated. Turkey is, again, there's been so much playing around with the border. In 2012, really the first wave of people fleeing went to the Hatay region, which of course had been Syria up until 1938, 1939. But again, here we have some massive numbers. 3.2 million is probably more than that, and I can explain why later on. Accepted as temporary. Well, in Turkey they don't use that term. In Turkey they're just called displaced Syrians. And Turkey has set up a domestic law in order to be able to provide displaced Syrians with healthcare and education through university is quite free. There's one little area here I just want to talk about here, because this area is basically as dark as it is because it's made up of the Circassians who've taken refuge in Turkey, and the Turkish government has actually allowed them to settle in the Circassian villages of Turkey itself. So this is the area that had been settled by Circassians after at the end of the 19th century. So that's one of the reasons why that area is so dark. And obviously, Istanbul, being a major city, is an area that would attract many people seeking refuge. Jordan, again, it's very similar. Most of the Syrians who've gone to Jordan have remained in the northern part of Jordan. Most of these are from the areas of southern Syria, of Daraa and the rural countryside, where they also had pre-existing tribal ties, kinship ties, economic ties. But I don't want to say that just because you have these ties, that means that there isn't a huge element of generosity that is being played out amongst Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, and also in parts of northern Iraq. But as time goes on, obviously, it becomes more and more difficult. I just want to quickly go on to my last few slides. I think one of the issues that is particularly difficult is the way in which Europe has responded to this really massive forced migration of people, neighbors on the Eastern Mediterranean. And I just want to go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which most countries have adhered to, because people seem to forget that Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, whether or not you've signed any other treaty, is about the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum for persecution. You know, it doesn't say to seek only in the first country you reach, but maybe in the country where you have an uncle or a mother or a brother. But this slowness to respond to the needs of people who are forced from their homes through conflict is perplexing, especially when you consider that at the end of World War II, Europe had more than 40 million European refugees, and eventually there were 7 million who were referred to as displaced persons, many of whom refused to return to the countries they had come from and needed to be repatriated. So the various UN agencies, both the UNHCR and then later on the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, worked together to help either resettle people in places where their work skills could be effective in helping them create livelihoods in dignity very quickly. And somehow I feel that these massive efforts we've forgotten. We haven't been able to do it successfully here, just as the Turks, the Ottomans, were also successful in resettling large numbers over very short periods of time. So I've just kind of run through to give you this idea of when you try to understand what is Syria and how are these countries surrounding Syria managing, history in its historical context is really important. I would say that people in the region haven't forgotten the movement of the populations of the 19th century, and the contemporary movement very much reflects this. Finding refuge with family, with tribe, and with pre-established networks is very important, and that's one of the reasons I think that you can see that Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan have all permitted their quite large numbers of Syrians to come across. But finding ways of surviving with dignity, creating livelihoods, has been very difficult. These are huge numbers, and these countries are not that wealthy. But having said that, there's still a high level of accommodation for displaced Syrians in the region, based, I think, very much on this notion of social duty, maybe reinforced by notions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when you look at what's happening on the ground and ignore some of the statements that emerge from government, you see there's a massive civilian initiative in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, and we're seeing it also in Europe, in the UK, in Germany, in Sweden, to try and help not just Syrians, but all people who have been displaced in order to stand on their own 2 feet and to live in dignity. But I will just show you here for a minute some of the agreed EU member state migrant quotas. Obviously, Germany is quite high, but you probably didn't realize that France has taken large numbers, so has Spain. Now, the UK isn't even on that list. But I think as citizens, maybe we can just do more to try and move to the next stage, because obviously those Syrians who've managed to leave Syria, many want to go back if they think they can go back and live safely, in dignity and in security. Perhaps the international organizations have to work in finding a way to make that possible. I don't know whether you can have peace and safety armed forces with the UN, but until that time happens, perhaps temporary protection outside of the region is an answer that we could consider. Obviously, as long as President Trump is the president in the US, he's cut numbers down from close to 100,000 to I think 20,000, and he's excluded all Syrians from being granted access to protection in the US, but Canada hasn't, and many other countries haven't. But I think we, as citizens of whatever country we belong to, can push perhaps for some sort of temporary accommodation until Syrians can go back to their own country, as many still want to do. So I'm going to end here, shut this down. I've gone a little bit over time, but I will just say I brought a few copies of my book, which try to give you a sense, which I wouldn't have had time here, of how these various communities have actually managed to integrate very successfully and are part of the fabric of what is Syria. It's still played out even in exile. I still come across communities of Syrians in Abu Dhabi, in Sweden, in Norway, and even those that are now have managed to make it into Oxford. They are all hoping to go back, and in the meantime, trying to find ways of at least temporarily being integrated so that they can make a contribution to the country where they're being hosted. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for the great presentation, the lecture, and sorry everyone, we're running a little bit late, but if you can be patient, if you want to leave, please do so, but maybe we can take 1-2 questions from each side of the room, if you're happy to stay for 5 minutes, otherwise please just feel free to leave. So, are there any questions on this side here that we can give to Dawn? Anyone interested from the left side of the room? Maybe from the middle then, yeah.
I'm going to butcher the question, but when you said that Syria was accepting people and they were allowed to live under their own rule together, what does that mean in practice? That each community, you gave the impression that each community kind of govern themselves. What does that mean in practice?
Right.
I said I'd probably do.
The Ottoman Empire, particularly during the 19th century, which was a period of great reform, the Ottomans felt they were part of the community of European nations, and they felt the reform behind, so they instituted massive reforms in the 19th century, which actually ended up having urban centers like Damascus way ahead of places like Glasgow. But part of those reforms were not just about infrastructure, education, but they were about legalizing. They were about legalizing the protection of the Dhimmi community within Islam, and the Dhimmi are the non-Muslims. So what the Ottomans did during the Tanzimat was formally set up legislation that gave the heads of these ethno-religious communities, like the Grand Rabbi, the right to establish family law and to manage the basic requirements of the Jewish community throughout the Ottoman Empire: birth, life, death, divorce, etc., etc. The same was done for the Christians, and initially there was one millet for the Jews and another one for Christians, but in the 19th century, in large part due to massive missionary activity, particularly from American Protestants and some of the Presbyterians and the Jesuits and others, the Christian millet became subdivided into a Catholic millet where they could follow the Catholic, I guess the Archbishop. There was also a Protestant, and then eventually there was Bulgarian, because there was a Bulgarian church. There was a separate Armenian church. So all of these different groups basically self-ruled themselves. The kind of, you could probably live your life and never have to go to an Ottoman court, because everything could be handled in the ethno-religious court. That was codified during the 19th century. And along with that was the creation of a constitution with a certain number of seats guaranteed for each of these different millets. So that's basically what I was referring to.
Hello. I was just curious, the numbers of migrants that you quoted through the 19th century, can you put that in context with the population of the Ottoman Empire at the time?
Yes, that's a very good question. We're talking about 4 million entering the empire at a time when the empire was about 32 million. Big numbers. I think it's almost... Yeah, it's a bit like what Sweden has been able to manage. Or no, it's not quite 10%, is it, in Sweden, but pretty big. It's probably the... It was very big numbers. And they, in my field, they often talk about the refugee regime didn't develop until 1920 with the Nansen regime of creating passports so that forced migrants, people who had been stripped of their nationality, they were referring to, in 1921, Lenin stripped all the non-Bolshevik Russians who were in Europe of their nationality. and they couldn't move, they couldn't do anything. And so the League of Nations set up the first refugee regime to give Russians travel documents so they could go and find work, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess what I'm trying to say to you is actually we should look back to the Ottoman Empire, because they set up the first regime to be able to deal with massive numbers of forced migrants, and they did a pretty good job of it.
You want 2 questions from this side, anyone? Before we take another last one from here? Anyone from this side? Okay, so maybe final question then.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for your call. Just to support what you said, I'm originally from Syria and from Damascus, and you're right, some families' names, they kept it. So the people from Dagestani, they called Dagestani family. And they spoke Arabic, and they spoke their own languages, and they had their own languages. So I support what you just said.
I don't have time to give a big aside, but I've given these anecdotes sometimes in my book. When I first got to the Middle East in the 1970s, I was looking for a Bedouin tribe to live with. I wanted to somehow work against this notion that Bedouin have to be settled. And I had gone down to Amman to talk to Kamal Abu Jaber, who at that time was the dean of the School of Economics, to see where I could go. Anyway, it didn't work. And I was standing around waiting for a shared taxi to go back to Damascus. And the taxi drivers used to come up and say, Sham, Beirut, Halab, calling out the names of different cities. And I was standing there, and all of a sudden one of them came over and says, Ghazni, and I'm instead of standing there thinking, why would a taxi go to Chechnya? I mean, I had no idea. And many people had no idea how many Circassians, Caucasian, were in the region. But living and spending time in Damascus, again, I was absolutely staggered with, you go up to Hajrin, which is the ridge at the top of Damascus. And you suddenly discover that all of the buildings, not all of the buildings that are there now, but the first social housing for refugees was built there for Muslims from Crete, who had to come in the 1890s when Crete decided it wanted to be part of Greece. And then you go somewhere else and you find it's a Kosovar quarter, or it's a Uzbek quarter, or it's fascinating, because these were not ghettos, but they were neighborhoods where people actually, you could see there was a kind of pleasure in knowing something about the other that I just never get over, and I hope it remains. And what I always argue is that if Syrians in their exile are treated well, they will be able to return and recreate that kind of cosmopolitanism, even if it might take another decade or 2.
Okay, wonderful. Really, thanks a lot, Dawn, and thanks everyone for coming today. If you want a copy of the book, please stay for 5-10 minutes. Otherwise, the room is booked till 6:30, I'm afraid, so we have to actually leave soon. Thank you very much. Thanks.